So good afternoon. Welcome to the first session in this webinar series, Open Science into Practice, organized by the Dutch Research Council NWO. My name is Hans de Jonge. I'm the policy lead for Open Science at NWO, and I will be your host this afternoon. I'm joined also here by my colleague Maria Cruz, who's the organizer of this webinar series, and together also with our colleague Steffi Holst, the driving force behind the Open Science Fund. We are delighted to see so many people also still dropping in. Welcome, everyone. We've had almost 200 registrations for this first edition of the webinar series. Really great to see, mostly colleagues from the Netherlands, but also participants from as far as Brazil, Denmark, Moldavia, Indonesia. So really great to see you all in this webinar. So today marks the start of a new series of webinars titled Open Science into Practice. And during this series, we will highlight some of the projects that have been awarded an NWO Open Science Fund grant. As many of you will know, the Open Science Fund at NWO is a new funding stream we launched last year, and which provides financial support for researchers who are at the forefront of open science. The aim is to support open science projects, but also to really give a boost to the recognition and rewards for researchers who bring open science into practice. And we were very happy to see that there was a lot of interest from the community in this Open Science Fund. So in the first round, we received no less than 167 eligible proposals, of which, with the help of a very knowledgeable committee, we have been able to fund 26 in the end. And these 26 projects cover a very broad range of open science practices and projects in the area of open access publishing, fair data, but also projects in the area of the cultural change that is needed to boost open science. And what we will do in the coming months is to highlight some of these projects in this webinar series. And today is the first edition of that webinar series. Let me share the program of today. So the program is quite straightforward. We will have 2 talks of about 20 minutes each, and then we will have ample room for questions and answers and discussions, and I will do my best to try to moderate that. And you can use the chat function to ask any questions you might have. Okay, so over to the speakers of today. I'm really very excited that today we are joined by 2 true leaders in open science, not only in the Netherlands, but globally, I would say. Both have been granted, as you understand, the Open Science grant from NWO, and they will talk about the projects they are starting up right now. First, we will hear from Ludo Waldman. Ludo is Professor of Quantitative Science Studies and Deputy Director at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, CWTS, at Leiden University. His work focuses on developing new infrastructures, algorithms, and tools to support research assessment, science policy, and scholarly communication. Ludo has done some very important work also in the area of open metadata of scholarly communication, especially in the area of the Initiative for Open Citations and the Initiative for Open Abstracts. And Ludo enjoys also a certain renown, I think, because in 2019, as the editor-in-chief of the journal Informatics, he decided to start a new fully open access journal, Qualitative Science Studies, because of the unwillingness, at that moment at least, of Elsevier to share openly metadata of the journals they publish. And today he will tell us something about the project he is setting up right now to build and develop an open journal observatory. After Ludo, we will hear from Jean-Sébastien Coe. Jean-Sébastien is professor in physics at the University of Amsterdam, and Jean-Sébastien is well known in the community because he's the founder of SciPost, a fully open access publishing platform that hosts 5 journals in the area of physics, but is expanding to other fields also. SciPost is a non-profit, scholar-led platform built by Sebastian using open source software. And although I know Jean-Sébastien prefers an alternative terminology, SciPost is considered a diamond or platinum open access journal, which means authors don't have to pay to publish. Jean-Sébastien has also been awarded an Open Science Fund for the next stage development of the platform, and he will tell us something about that very shortly. But first, I want to give the floor to Ludo, and I stop sharing my screen for you.
Okay, thank you, Hans, for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here, I must say. The very first seminar in this series, and also the whole new Open Science Fund set up by NWO. I'm really pleased to see that we are moving in this direction in the Netherlands, and that I can be part of that development. So I will share my screen to open my slides. So I will present to all of you the Journal Observatory project that I'm going to work on together with a number of colleagues in the coming year. Hans already briefly mentioned my own kind of connection to the topic of journals and all the questions that journal publishing raises. How should journal publishing be done? How can we really have a proper way of disseminating scientific knowledge through scientific journals, doing peer review in a proper way, all these difficult but very important questions. As editor of a journal myself, I've learned a lot in the past years about these difficult questions, about the dilemmas that we often face. I admire people that take big steps and that do innovative things in this area, like we will see in the second presentation, the SciPost work. I think that's really important. What I will present today, the Journal Observatory project, is not so much an idea on the direction in which the publishing system should move. Instead, it is an idea on how we can actually together think about and debate the direction in which publishing should or could develop. So the Journal Observatory is an infrastructure that ultimately should provide systematic, high-quality information on scientific journals, so that all of us, researchers, librarians, funders, publishers, all of us, so that we can together discuss scholarly publishing, how it is organized, how we want it to be organized, how we can get there. And I would like that discussion to be based on proper information. And the Journal Observatory has the ambition to offer that information so that we really have a well-informed debate about how we organize scholarly publishing. This is the team. It's myself and 2 colleagues, Neesja van Eck and Bram van den Bomen from the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. Nees and Bram will take responsibility for many of the more technical aspects of the project. I'm also very glad that we have Tony Ros-Hellauer from Graz University of Technology in the team. Many of you will know him as an expert in many areas of open science. And we have Sergio Horbach from Aarhus University, who has also a lot of expertise in open science, scholarly publishing, peer review, all these topics that are I believe, really essential for the ambition that we have in the Journal Observatory project. I also want to mention that both Serge and Tony have worked previously on building infrastructures for journals, the Transpose infrastructure, the platform for responsible editorial practices. So these are earlier initiatives, and the idea is that the Journal Observatory will partly build on this earlier work by Serge, by Tony, but also by many other people all around the world. So that's the plan. This paper is an illustration of the problem that I feel needs to be addressed. So this paper, published in 2020, basically makes clear that for many journals, we have very little information about how they actually organize their peer review, how they, for instance, think about preprinting, whether they feel preprinting is a good idea, preprinting should be encouraged, or perhaps preprinting is in some way problematic. We actually don't know, because many journals do not provide information about that. So when you look at the policies journals have on their websites, for instance, you will, for instance, for 1/3 of the journals, you will see that it's actually unclear how they organize peer review. For 40% of the journals, it is not clear how preprinting is what the position of the journal is with respect to preprinting. So many journals actually are not explicit about this. They do not have clear policies, and that's a problem, of course. That's a problem, first of all, for authors. As an author, when you submit to a journal, of course, you want to know what you can expect from the journal. So you would expect that information to be available on the journal website. As a reviewer for the journal, you are, of course, also entitled to know, for instance, whether your identity will be revealed, to know kind of what kind of information you will get yourself as a reviewer. All these things are important to know, but many journals actually do not really provide proper information on these things. At a higher level, of course, we have policy making around scientific publishing. We have publishers, we have libraries, research institutions, funders. All these different actors in the research system have ideas about the direction in which perhaps the scholarly publishing system should move. But again, it's difficult to make policies if you do not even have proper information. It's also difficult to actually discuss or debate what kind of policies need to be made, and it's even more difficult to track progress, so to see how we are indeed moving in a particular direction. For instance, how we are moving towards more openness in scholarly publishing. It's hard to measure progress without proper data or proper information. And that's the problem that the Journal Observatory ultimately should solve. So here you see some of these questions that I believe are really important, and we need information to answer these questions. So how is quality assurance and peer review organized by different journals? To what extent do different journals support open access publishing? What kinds of open metadata around articles do journals make available? What is the position of journals with respect to all kinds of open science practices like pre-registration, pre-printing, and data sharing? What actually what's the composition of the editorial teams of journals, for instance, in terms of the diversity of the members of these teams? When you look at researchers that publish in a journal or that review for the journal, what kind of experiences do they have? Are they satisfied? Did they experience difficulties? Where the kind of expectations that they had, were they met by the journal or not? And ultimately also, what kind of impact does the research published in a journal actually have? We know, of course, that we can count citations and we have impact factors, but that's just one particular way of thinking about impact and a rather narrow perspective on impact. So impact is, of course, a much broader concept, and actually we don't know so much about this broader notion of impact and the extent to which journals have impact in that broader sense. So these are all kinds of questions that we have about journals, questions that actually are important to answer if we want to promote innovation in the way scholarly publishing is done, for instance, innovation towards more openness, but we have only partial answers to all these questions. So what you see on this slide is infrastructures or data sources, databases that provide information about journals. This is probably not exhaustive, but these are the infrastructures that I'm familiar with myself. And all of these infrastructures, they offer some information about what's happening in the scholarly publishing system and what kind of policies journals have and what kind of other features journals have. So we have information about open access publishing, information about editorial policies, information about the experiences that researchers have in publishing in particular journals, bibliometric statistics about journals. We have all of this, but it is really extremely scattered, and it's a complex landscape with many different tools, many different infrastructures, and most people, of course, will get lost in this complex landscape. An ordinary researcher is really not able to just understand all these different tools that are available out there and what they offer and what they do not offer. So this is not really helpful in the end, I believe. So the Journal Observatory is not going to be yet another infrastructure. Instead, it is going to be an infrastructure that will hopefully provide a way of offering an integrated perspective on the information that is available in all the existing infrastructures. So there is a lot of information in the existing infrastructures, but it is scattered. The Journal Observatory will bring it together and will provide easy access to the research community, to all that important information. So this requires the information to be made interoperable, machine readable. It requires probably a website to be created that researchers can access, and that provides a kind of easy way to understand all this information about journals. So that's the direction in which we want to move. 2 years ago, in 2020, we organized, so we meet together with a number of colleagues, we organized a workshop around this idea that there is a need to have more systematic information about journals. So we brought together many of the stakeholders in this landscape, and I think the analysis was basically shared by everyone. The analysis that there is a problem at the moment, that the information is too scattered, it's too difficult to find it, and there's a need to bring it together. So this blog post basically summarizes the outcomes of that workshop, and what we conclude in the blog post is that hopefully it's possible to move towards a more ambitious long-term agenda aimed at working towards some kind of an integrated infrastructure for providing systematic and reliable information on scholarly journals. And that's where we are at the moment. And thanks to the NWO Open Science Fund, we are now able to take some first concrete steps in this direction. So the aims that we have. The first aim, from my point of view, is actually to just make sure that all the relevant stakeholders, at least all the stakeholders that feel a certain commitment to this idea, this philosophy, that they are brought together so that we can together discuss how we can actually realize this idea. And that's what we would like to do in the Journal Observatory project. So building on what we already started to do 2 years ago, we would like to bring all these stakeholders together and to actually start to think about how we can realize this idea of a journal observatory. And the first thing that probably then needs to be done, the second aim on this slide, is to design a framework for making journal information accessible in a machine-readable way. So we have all these infrastructures at the moment. They have a lot of valuable information, but it's hard to exchange that information. So there are difficult questions around interoperability and ways in which we can, in a standardized way, make that information accessible and machine readable. So we want to make a kind of, at a conceptual level, a framework for addressing that particular problem. And then third, at a more concrete level, we want to build a prototype that actually implements this framework and that offers a kind of proof of concept of the Journal Observatory. So we will not be able, we have just 1 year, we will not be able to build the full observatory, but we do aim to create a prototype, a proof of concept of this observatory that basically shows how it could all work, and that shows this for a limited amount perhaps limited amount of journals, a limited set of information sources that we bring together. But this is what we hope to accomplish in the coming year. To go a little bit in more detail, This framework that I mentioned, this framework for making journal information machine readable, we will be facing questions, for instance, about the standard for sharing information about journals, and questions about the trade-off between having a very strict standard that is clear and easy to understand, but perhaps also a bit inflexible, versus having a much more generic standard. So that's the types of discussions we need to have. Different technical models for retrieving or depositing data, the challenge of harmonizing information from different sources, especially when the data or the information is partly overlapping but not necessarily consistent. Also questions about licensing conditions. So many of the existing data sources are open in some sense, but nevertheless they may impose particular restrictions on the use of their data. So we need to really make sure we understand that properly. One project that is kind of offering inspiration to what we hope to do in the coming year is the DocMaps project that some of you may be familiar with. It's a kind of framework for describing in a systematic way how documents are created and how they evolve. This is now being used, for instance, to describe how we have preprints and how we have peer reviews around preprints. It's a really interesting concept, and this might be something that could also be helpful in the context of a journal observatory. So we may perhaps have a journal maps framework that is inspired by this DocMaps idea. I already mentioned the prototype that we plan to build. So what you can expect in about 1 year. 1 year from now, we will have a simple website and also an API that provides access for humans and for machines to information about the journal, and that information has been obtained from a number of underlying data sources that have been connected to each other, that have been linked to each other using this framework for machine readable journal information. So in that sense, the prototype should offer a proof of concept of this idea. So you could, for instance, imagine that we will have a prototype that offers information about open access policies of journals, peer review policies, and perhaps also some bibliometric features of journals. So that's what we are aiming for. This is an interesting project that some of you may be familiar with, STM. So Association of Publishers, they have been working on a standardized terminology for peer review, for describing how journals organize their peer review. And more journals now use this on their websites to explain their peer review policy in a standardized way. However, this is not at the moment machine readable. So this is just something that publishers use for their websites. The next step that we hope to take, ideally together with the publishers that have worked on developing this terminology, we hope to take a next step by making all of this machine readable, so that this information can easily be exchanged, can easily be made available through all kinds of infrastructures. So that's a conversation that has actually already started, and that I hope can be one element in the project that we are going to carry out in the coming year. So the next steps is basically, first of all, to get started with the stakeholder engagement, forming a stakeholder group. So we will have a workshop next month where we will start all of this. Probably we will then also quite quickly already start to move towards selecting specific pilots that we would like to carry out together with some of these stakeholders. And we then basically have 1 year to build all of this and to develop this framework, to create this prototype. So it's quite ambitious, a lot of work to do, but we are quite positive that we will be able to get there. And I do want to make a really explicit invitation to anyone who is in the webinar today. If you feel that you are in some sense a stakeholder and that you may be able to contribute in some way to realizing this vision of a journal observatory, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. To conclude, the long-term vision, so we have funding for 1 year. That should be enough to make this prototype and to develop this framework, but it's not enough, of course, to really have a sustainable, high-quality, comprehensive journal observatory. That is a much bigger effort. And therefore, we have a long-term vision. So we hope that the stakeholders that will start working on this together with us in the coming year, that in some way we will find out how they can continue the development of this framework, how they can further extend it, how they can build on what we're going to do in the coming year. And then, of course, also we hope that the framework will actually be implemented systematically by basically any organization that makes data available about scientific journals. So that data should by default always be made accessible, not only through a website for humans, but also in a machine readable way. Following the framework that we will be developing. And ultimately, of course, so getting back to where I started, ultimately, the idea is that this should support researchers, publishers, librarians, funders, and basically anyone else involved in scholarly communication. It should support all of us to discuss how we want to transition towards a better, a more open scholarly publishing, scholarly communication system. So in the end, I would argue that what we're going to build in this project is a tool that serves as that's not really the ultimate goal in itself, but that should support in the end this transition to more open ways of working, and that is ultimately what this is all about. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ludo, for your very inspiring talk. I see there's already questions coming in. Please continue typing those in, but we will come to that after we have heard from Jean-Sebastian. Jean-Sebastian, can I give you the floor?
Okay, sure. So while I share my screen, Ludo, you can already count on my SciPost's involvement and interest in what you do. So, certainly we want to keep abreast, and if we can help a bit, then let us know. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank Hans and the team at NWO and the NWO itself for organizing this series here. I think this is a wonderful start that Ludo gave to this. I hope I'll follow in his footsteps. I have 20 minutes to kind of tell you a little bit about what we're going to try to do as part of this project here. And since I'm not quite sure that everybody's very familiar with SciPost, I want to spend a few minutes at the beginning just to familiarize yourself with some of the basic aspects of the initiative. Okay, so what is it and where is it going? What's the plan? I want to give you a couple of generic statements about SciPost. Then I want to give you a few highlights of best practices, which we try to implement. Then I want to spend a certain amount of time talking about the current infrastructure and how that fits into the further development that we want to power through the NWO grant that was given. Okay, so SciPost, if you're not already very familiar with it, then it's quite simply a complete publishing portal. It essentially covers everything that you need from preprints to metadata curation for running the whole peer review, publishing process and curation afterwards. And the important thing is that it's very much based on the grassroots of academics worldwide trying to get it run. So it's by and for scientists. It's a not-for-profit foundation, which is established in the Netherlands, but really it's the professional academics run it. And what does it offer? Well, primarily it's just a set of journals, new journals that were started from scratch from the initiative to try to offer, a bit of novelty, a bit of movement in the thing. And if you were to summarize it in 2 words, then it's really that we're trying to leverage openness to push for quality at all levels, be that, the peer review system or even the financial shenanigans behind the whole thing. What does SciPost aim to achieve? Well, really to provide a positive push at all levels for publishing, be that at the level of implementing open access and what I like to call genuine open access, really true to spirit open access, to implement a much healthier business model also for paying for the whole infrastructure that does this task of publishing that is so important for all of us. We want to kind of maybe bring the refereeing procedure to a kind of more modern world with the facilities that we have now. It's easy to have different types of communications there. We want to give much more credit to the work of referees, which is extremely valuable, but undervalued up to now in the closed door refereeing systems. That's why we go open on that. And we want in due term to also reform impact assessment, because we're very interested in metadata, how that relates to how you can evaluate the quality of work that comes out, the impact of work that comes out. And these are parts of long-term development plans that we want to pursue. Hans said it very briefly. So started in physics, 2016, 5 journals. The main flagship is SciPost Physics, the first one to start, but these days it's broadened out to a number of other ones. I think this morning we published the 1140th publication. You know, it's growing relatively large scale. If you want to compare in scale, it's about the same as Wellcome Open Research, started at the same time, and then almost the same number of publications. So we like to think that we have a harder refereeing process here. So we're quite proud of the number of publications that have come out our door since the beginning. Okay, so just maybe a couple of examples of best practice that SciPost tries to implement in its publishing. I want to highlight 3 things very quickly and then spend much more time on the infrastructure side. But the first thing maybe that you should know about is about the editorial workflow at SciPost. It's a kind of glorification of the idea of using openness in the evaluation here in order to ensure multiple levels of verification, counter verification, impossibility of having, you know, single people making decisions that lead to acceptance or rejection. So what's the idea? The main idea is that the reports which are given on submissions have their contents made publicly available. This puts a lot of pressure on the referees because they do have to produce meaningful reports, hopefully useful reports for the authors. One of the ideas is that knowing that your report is going to be publicly read means that you take a little bit more care in what you write and how you write it. So you bring the level of discussion to a higher level of maturity by doing this. It's important to understand that referees can remain anonymous if they so wish. We do encourage people to sign their reports. That's what we do, after all, as academics on conferences. We just talk to each other and we don't put, you know, paper bags over our heads to hide who we are. It is possible to have a mature discussion at that level. The second very important aspect is that all editorial decisions are taken by a community of people that we call the fellows, editorial colleges composed of fellows. I studied in Oxford, that's why this is kind of called like that. The idea is that all the editorial decisions are taken by groups of fellows with expertise matching the specialties covered in the submission. That's another extremely important aspect. Maybe another very important aspect is that it is possible for registered contributors to SciPost, professional academics, to volunteer reports on submissions that are undergoing evaluation. Referees get invited specifically by the editor in charge, but it is also possible to submit a report even if you are not invited. You can contribute a report which will be taken into account during the evaluation. And contributors can also, say, comment on a report that has been posted on a certain submission before any decision is taken. Okay, so it's meant to be a much more like a lively debate before any decision is taken. You can read much more about this procedure on our instructions on the site. Maybe the second thing I do want to highlight, though I don't want to talk money here, this is not the purpose of the meeting, or at least business model. So Hans already mentioned it. So the term diamond is universally used for these things now. I've got a great love for metals, a bit of a hobby metal worker myself. So I really like calling things or classifying things with metals. And for me, I prefer saying that SciPost is a platinum palladium initiative because there are no APCs, no author-facing charges of any form, no subscriptions, of course, that's like very outdated. And the operations that SciPost has are fully not-for-profit, and that then qualifies them as palladium. So you can be diamond without being platinum palladium. The costs that we average over our operations are at the moment of about 600 euros per publication. We have a full production service taking care of all the author proofs and metadata curation. That costs a little bit of money. What mostly costs money are the personal costs for the editorial admin team that shepherds the submissions through the whole process. So assisting fellows, assisting authors, referees, that's a lot of work. Okay, and because we don't charge APCs, there's no invoice sent out when a paper is published. So we live off the goodwill of academic institutions throughout the world that recognize the value of what we do and therefore decide to sponsor us. There is no link between the amount of money that an institution gives us and the rights to publish a certain number of papers. SciPost enforces a completely strict decoupling between any editorial and any financial dealings. I like to call that lead pollution in industry when you've got these things entangled. And I think everybody knows all the problems that were caused by the appearance of APCs and why this is a business model which should be kind of worked out of the system. Unfortunately, this is not where we're going overall, but SciPost is very much against APCs in that sense. And we hope to offer a kind of viable alternative to that. Viable, but also much cheaper. So hopefully institutions will tap in on that opportunity. Okay. So another thing which I do want to emphasize is that SciPost really has no further agenda than serving the academic community. We only care about scientific quality. And the fellows, for example, we have, among each other, fellows have a lot of communications with all the dealings. We just finished this year's virtual general meeting, which is a meeting that we hold once a year with all fellows of all colleges to discuss how things are going, how we can improve things. There's been, a lot of useful suggestions made here, so we're kind of working on that. And we're trying to be as responsive to the community as we can be in that sense. We're very proud of our kind of closeness to the community here. Okay, so let's now start talking about infrastructure. Again, Hans, I think, introduced all these themes beautifully. So SciPost is really built from scratch off free software, free and open source software. The whole tech stack is based on pieces of software frameworks that you can use for your own purposes. So for example, the whole platform is primarily built on the Django framework, which is a Python-based web framework, which is very, very famous. It was started for like news agencies and things, but it's become extremely large scale, and it's got a very healthy life ahead of it for various reasons. And then, if there are some techies among you, I can spend hours telling you all about the technical details of this. All the other things that we use are things that are just commonly used in, web portals that are developed left, right, and center. There are some very exciting developments in that. So for example, on the third point, I have Vue.js barred out and replaced by HTMX. If any of you have been involved in big questions about the way modern web development is, which way it's going and why, in a sense, it's wrong and you should go back to the original idea of the web, then I'll be happy to have a separate debate on this. So we're kind of trying to be very much at the forefront of technology here. So I think HTMX, for example, is a very, very, very clean new technology that is able to replace these very heavily bloated JavaScript frameworks that are typically used in these separate front-end, back-end installations. So we're playing a lot with both here, but I've recently chosen to go down the HTMX route. I'll show you some examples of that later, just for fun. So if you look at the whole set of SciPost services, there are many, many different machines doing very many different things. There's, of course, the central site, which holds essentially all the important information. But we're plugged into a number of other services that we run that I'll very, very quickly highlight as we go along. So first of all, we've got a kind of very complicated emailing system with various systems. Maybe I don't need to insist too much on this. If you're interested, you can always contact me to ask details. Maybe more importantly, we're also developing things that would be of use for people trying to gather data. So we've got a simple browsable API for some of our objects here. We want to build that up also as part of our NWO project. A very important thing is that the whole software stack powering SciPost is available under the AGPL version 3 license at our repository server at git.scipost.org. So there we hold the main code for the central the central portal, and also other little bits and pieces that we've tweaked for our purposes. So this is just a GitLab instance which we run ourselves. The repo itself is mirrored on GitHub, so you can also find everything on GitHub if you prefer. We also have token documentation available at docs.scipost.org that contains technical level information about the way the code is built, how the infrastructure is deployed, and who holds responsibilities for these things. We also have a separate server, a discourse instance, where we like to run community discussions on certain things. So if we need to like consult people on this or that aspect, or want to hear what they want, then they can do that there. So this kind of galaxy of little machines provides us with a pretty complete way of interacting with our community and responding to their wishes and desires. So talking about infrastructure, let's now talk about this project that the NWO, thankfully funded here. We're extremely grateful for the continued support of NWO. This is not the first time we got support from NWO. These people have been backing us ever since day one, and we're extremely grateful, because I don't think SciPost would be anywhere near what it is today without the support that we've obtained from NWO. Maybe SciPost would not have been even started had there not been a kind of feeling at the beginning that NWO was behind the project. So we're very, very thankful for this. So what are we going to do then with the money that we got? So the NWO made 42,000 euros available for us to get programming help, which is going to be great for me, because I'm not going to have to do everything myself, but I'll be able to have somebody help me on this. So the general plan can be summarized in the following points. We want to greatly improve navigation and user experience on the site. There's a lot of stuff happening at SciPost, and sometimes you have to know what you're looking for in order to find it. So we really want to make that much easier. And the big elephant in the room is really this point here, that we want to enable a broader user base here. And what I mean by this is that SciPost has been very active in physics up to now, but we want to cover other communities and different disciplines. We'd like to cover chemistry, astronomy, etc., and maybe even make it completely universal. And that requires some adaptations, some maybe machinery that facilitates this, and this is part of the project that's going to be done. We want to really improve workflows as much as possible, like Elon Musk recommends. Also, if you can automate. We're going to try to build many of these things in there. We really need to improve our communications facilities. I'm personally, for example, not a fan of Twitter and social media and that sort of thing. I have very few followers, not very active in there. We need to really communicate more, do more for these communications facilities in there. One of the things that I really want to do is improve the links with external services. We already have working integrations with many preprint servers, for example, so that you can do submission with one click if you have the identifier of the paper that you have on certain preprint servers. But we also have integrations with things like Authenticate, Crossref, and all the standard things, DOAJ and whatnot. But I think it's possible to make this integration much more tight. We'd also like to integrate with, say, institutional repositories in various places, for example, the HAL system in France and many other places. So, let machines talk to machines using the right protocols. So part of this also is to expand greatly the API services that we offer here and dealing with metadata. And that's why, Ludo, we have to become much better friends, because I think we both have a predilection for metadata, and I'd be very, very happy to exchange some, geek plans about metadata with you. Okay. One of the things also, which is very important, part of user experience, is the search facility that's available on the site. And so we're all going to try to do that. So there's a job open. Anybody with technical knowledge, essentially full stack, can be front end, back end. We need both. If you know people who are technically able to do these things and who are knowledgeable in the frameworks that we use, please direct them towards us. Maybe before I finish, I just want to give you a bit of a preview of certain things, and let me see if I can manage to do this. I'd like to give you a preview of what's like immediately coming. So you should see the new homepage of SciPost. We've started rebuilding things from scratch, and this is what the homepage is going to look like approximately. Maybe we'll open it up next week or something like that. It's almost ready to go. But the main point is that we want to make it much easier for people in different fields to find what they are looking for. Therefore, for example, if you're coming to have a look at the journals that we have available, you can specialize to the academic field of your predilection. Okay, you can come and have a look and then specialize to your particular field. If you're interested in the publications that we have, then again, maybe you can specialize from one field to another and focus down to various, specializations if you so wish. And so these new technologies that we're using here are responsive technologies that are based on HTMX that I'm very enthusiastic about, and that we want to pepper all over the site in order to make navigation much easier and much faster. So you come and you want to maybe find the papers of somebody, and you can just come and have a little look and find it within a few seconds. I would really like navigation on SciPost to be like this, the fastest there is available. And we're also building advanced search APIs, but maybe I can kind of leave that for later. So essentially, this is where this is going. This project of the NWO is going to help us achieve this. And I want to leave with just maybe a little thought about the future here, future perspective. To me, I view this as part of the big movement for open access. And I think there's a word of warning here, which is that there are some uncomfortable parallels with the world of Linux. And for me, it goes like this. So Linux is obviously the better operating system, but it's admittedly much less easy to use. And of course, it's competing against gigantic corporations that have got a lot to lose. And these corporations are extremely good at, customer lock-in. So Linux is very much a fragmented community because it's a community of diverse ideas. Therefore, there's no unified, front for all of this. And in the end, if you observe what happens, Linux is only adopted by a tiny minority. Of course, the truly critical infrastructure, everything that runs the web, runs on Linux. But the user front end is mostly not Linux. And that is despite all the absolutely compelling advantages of this on the, say, indeed, privacy side, flexibility, customizability, and of course, cost advantages. So for me, I put that tweet last year when I kind of really finally went back all the way to Linux there. And I would like open science to avoid becoming something which is perpetually marginal like Linux is. So we'll see how that goes. And just at the end, these are the current team members of SciPost, a team of very productive individuals that keep all the machines going. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and be open for your questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Jean-Sebastian, for your very inspiring talk, and glad to see a new friendship arising between a nerdy friendship between the both of you.
I love metadata nerds.
Great. So I'd really like to invite the audience to put their questions in the chat. I've already seen some very interesting questions, but I take the liberty to as I'm the moderator, to start off the discussion and also ask about what would be maybe something about the intersections of both of your projects. So where do they meet? So Ludo, it's clear from your presentation that your aim is to build a journal observatory. It won't be finished after this one-year project, but hopefully you will be able to deliver a minimal viable product, or even more. So in what way would you think Jean-Sebastian with SciPost would benefit from such an infrastructure? And maybe also then for Jean-Sebastian, how do you expect to benefit from Ludo's project if it's successful? But first, Ludo.
Yes, well, personally, I'm very, that's perhaps not a surprise, but I'm very sympathetic to the ideas of SciPost and the philosophy. However, having just a few researchers who like something is not enough to really kind of move an entire system, the entire research system in a particular direction. So what I think could be the contribution of the Journal Observatory to promote ideas like those of SciPost, and to possibly even help construct even better ideas for how scholarly publishing could be done. I think that the Journal Observatory should give visibility to the types of journals that are really innovative, that really stand out in a particular way, and should also make it easier for basically anyone in the research system to kind of adjust our behavior in such a way that we start to make use of all these new innovations. So for research, it should be easier to find these types of journals that perhaps many of them are not even familiar with. For funders, for research institutions, there should be kind of awareness that it's important to in their policy making to not just make policies that work well for the kind of the more traditional journals, but that actually policies that have a clear philosophy on actually how we can potentially make use of all these interesting innovations, and how perhaps also, but that's really up to these organizations, how we can stimulate researchers to move in that direction. So that's what the Journal Observatory should promote, or at least the Journal Observatory should stimulate the discussion about all of this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Jean-Sebastian, what would you hope to see from the observatory?
So I believe very much in this kind of image that we have of openness as being this ray of sunlight coming onto the field and really showing the truth, showing things how they are. I really hope the Journal Observatory will make correct perceptions of existing journals and how they work and what they stand for much more transparent. And let me kind of highlight one of the things which has been, quite painful over the last few years, because I've talked to countless academics, including editors of various journals. And I'm sorry to say that in a great number of cases, the editors working for journals were blissfully unaware of the underlying protocols, mechanisms, business models associated to that. And I think this kind of situation is very damaging for us because, so for example, SciPost, we don't charge APCs, we are not for profit, but this is insufficiently known. And very often people tell us that, oh yeah, but I work for this journal there, but they're open access. So what's the problem? Yeah, well, the problem is that look at the business model behind it and, ask yourself here. So if this information was more easily accessible, then it would be much better. So as far as SciPost is concerned, there is no hesitation. The more information, the better. Let everything be transparent, easily accessible, easily comparable, and of course, accurate. And in that sense, we are more than willing to contribute all the information to be totally transparent about everything that happens on our side, what works well, what works less well. So I would hope that the Journal Observatory kind of goes in the direction of this.
Great, thanks. I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in, and I want to start off with one directed to Ludo about the choice of sources you make, and whether you also want to include, and how you would do that, to include a few of those well-known commercial data sources. Whether you expect to work with them and how that would be possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't actually explain that in the presentation, but it's a really important point. And my idea is that this issue of making choices like which data sources are valuable, relevant, important, that's a choice that is a choice where we also need to apply an open philosophy. So I, as a kind of individual, I have all kinds of opinions on sources, data sources that I like, data sources that I dislike, data sources that perhaps promote publishing practices that I think are not the right ones. But I think that my personal opinions on this should not actually determine what will be available in the Journal Observatory and what will not. So the philosophy should be that essentially anyone who is going to, any data source that's going to implement the framework for making information machine readable could connect its data to the observatory. And the observatory is not going to kind of decide what is relevant, valuable, and what is not. There is, of course, a challenge for commercial data sources in the sense that typically they want to protect their data, to keep it behind the paywall. And that is probably incompatible with the idea of the Journal Observatory, but I see that as a challenge for the commercial actors. So it's up to them to think about creative ways in which perhaps they can at least partly make some of their data accessible through the observatory. And indeed, after the workshop in 2020, some commercial actors did contact us and they seem to be interested in discussing these types of possibilities.
Okay, great, interesting. Another question from Anton to Jean-Sébastien about the optional anonymity of reports, how that would be compatible with the idea of increasing the level of responsibility of reviewers. Can you respond to that, Jean-Sébastien?
I think it's a simple psychological effect. Even if you know that the piece you put up doesn't carry your name, this piece will be visible by others and might be discussed by others, might be cited by others, might be referenced to by others. And I think certainly what we see is that people don't like, even if they're hidden behind a closed door, they don't like their idea to be, underappreciated, let's put it like that. So I think even while guaranteeing anonymity, the fact that the contents of the report come open does have essentially all the effect we wish to impose here, which is to enhance the quality of the reports. And maybe also, quite importantly, tone down the reports. In closed-door refereeing, very often you get these brutally insulting two-liners saying that this is just a piece of junk and it's all been done before. And if the authors were, smarter than their cats, they would never have done anything like that. And I do think, though I can't prove it, I do think that decades of closed-door refereeing have made that possible. People didn't used to talk like that when they were writing letters to each other, when they were meeting each other at conferences. And I do think that the closed door refereeing system has a lot of blame to shoulder on that particular front. And now, again, the idea of like opening it up, hopefully people are going to go, okay, yeah, cool down. Yeah, just let's cool down and be objective, factual. Let's be useful to the authors. That should be the purpose of a report. Why don't you propose useful things? Why don't you highlight what is good? Why don't you point out something that could be better? But without going for a fist fight, there's no. Yeah. But it's difficult because it's a transition between.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask to Ludo, because I know, Ludo, you wrote a very interesting blog post recently about open peer review and the things you want to do as a reviewer yourself. I know you have ambitions as an editor-in-chief or QSS, and we are of course also very grateful as NWO. That the both of you were that you have contributed to the openness that we have experimented with in relation to the grant reviewing process in this fund. So not many people from the audience might know, but we have opened up where we have the consent of the grantees project proposals and also the assessment of the proposals, and both of you have contributed to that. Thank you very much for that. But Ludo, open peer review, it's out there, but it's slowly. It's growing only slowly. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there are perhaps two issues. So one is that you see researchers like to have discussions with each other, to discuss research, to have intellectual exchanges. We all like that. That's why we go to conferences. But the peer review process has become something that is quite different from a genuine intellectual exchange. It's basically about, well, this is perhaps a bit too much, but in many cases, it's about finding the right arguments to justify rejection of an article. So it's very much focused ultimately at that decision that the journal needs to make acceptance, rejection. And we have, and I agree with Jean-Sebastian, we have moved towards a kind of culture where researchers have, reviewers have the feeling like, well, I'm apparently supposed to kind of help the editor build that argument. And that's very problematic. So that is one thing. And the other thing about and the puzzle of anonymity, that's really difficult because there are good reasons why people sometimes feel uneasy about their identity being revealed. But we should also realize that it's a bit strange that in peer review we are just used to being anonymous, while all the other things we do in science we are not anonymous, and actually we find it quite strange to be anonymous. So when we publish ourselves, our articles, it would be unacceptable to do that in an anonymous way. We all feel that you need to reveal your identity as an author, but only in the context of peer review we take a different position, and that I find a bit hard to understand.
Yeah. Looking at
if I can add just
of course,
one little thing on that point. So one of the things I often tell people, I mean, of course, non-anonymous reports, there are few at SciPost. So even though it's possible, it's the minority. We're talking like probably between 4 and 5%. It's increasing, but very slowly. And of course, the usual argument which is made, which is that if you're a young researcher and you publish a critical report on this senior researcher, you've just scuttled your chances for the grant and for the promotion and for the job. So you're crazy. But then you can actually turn that around, because if you're actually the young person who has shown that this Nobel Prize winner made this fumble, then you're going to get the job, maybe not from the Nobel Prize winner, but from somebody else. So there's, in a sense, much more to be won if you're actually doing things right. And if you're correct, then what's the point of, what is it? You wouldn't hide yourself in there. So I think again, it's a real question of culture change here. There need to be examples of people coming up with things like that and then making it. So so this guy got the or this young lady, she got the fellowship at Harvard. That's because of the kind of report she wrote on the other thing where she just torpedoed this group's thing. I remember that. So when you've got examples of that, then I think the culture will change.
Great, think so too. A question from Jeroen Bosman from Utrecht to Ludo about the intended audience for the observatory. Is that also authors and reviewers, or do you expect some of the information, once it is better visible, available through the observatory, will also find its way into other tools or sites? For instance, in the Netherlands, the Journal Browser tool, or I might add to that myself, the Journal Checker tool, which is developed by Coalition S. What's your view on that?
I think you can look at it at two levels. So on the one hand, I mentioned this prototype that we are going to create, and hopefully ultimately that will turn into a fully operational website, the Journal Observatory, providing all this information. That website could address, I think, on the one hand, researchers that just want to know what they get when they submit to a particular journal, when they review for a particular journal, but also policymakers. And that's what I explained. All the policy making around publishing needs to be supported by something like that. And the Journal Checker tool is actually also an example of the need for this. But I also think that the Journal Observatory, it is this platform, but it's also this what I called the framework around it, the framework for exchanging all this data in a machine readable way. So I could imagine that perhaps in the end, no one is really interested in using the particular platform that we are going to create, but people may actually start to adopt that framework, the standard, and use that to build their own websites. Perhaps they have much better ideas on how to build these websites, and what information to include and what to leave out. And I would be equally happy if that's the final result. So then actually we are not directly serving researchers and policymakers, but we help others serve these communities.
Yeah, interesting. Let me see. Patrick Koppenburg has a comment on the topic of open peer review. He says he loves it, but I have been in the situation of having to review for experiment X written by a colleague of mine I work with in experiment I. Being anonymous avoids the risk of settling the issue over coffee away from the journal interface. Someone of you who wants to comment on that?
I always wonder in these cases, what would happen if you meet at a conference, and a physical conference where you can have that cup of coffee together? Would you then also avoid talking about this issue because it feels uncomfortable? If that's the case, then perhaps I understand the motivation for being anonymous. But if you actually would have that conversation at such a conference, then why not also do it in peer review processes?
Jean-Sebastian, anything to add to that?
I think the one important distinction is that if you're having like a discussion around a coffee machine, then it's between you and that person and whoever happens to be around. Whereas if you have a system like at SciPost, where report goes up, reply goes up with names, we stick DOIs on these things. We have to serve them in perpetuity. There's no coming back. So I think that's the difference.
I want, if possible, I want to move to the topic of preprints that have been raised by both of you. Jean-Sebastian, you're basically coming from the community that invented preprints, I would say. Ludo, I know you have strong feelings about preprints, have studied the development of preprints in the recent years, also in relation to COVID. Could you, the both of you, elaborate a bit about your views on the future of preprints and the importance of them for the future of the scholarly communication system? Jean-Sebastian.
You've already said it, Hans. You know very much where I stand. I think that the appearance of preprint servers has been the single most important accelerator for science in the 20th century. I mean, okay, maybe electronic communication and stuff like that, but quite frankly, nothing compares, and there's no turning back. There's just no comparison. You're talking essentially immediate worldwide dissemination of new results. Of course, at the beginning, the history of the archive, there were, various nefarious attempts to bring it down because it was so threatening to various incumbents. But I think purely objectively on the scientific side, there's just no coming back. I mean, to me, this is a non-debate. Anybody having doubts about preprints, essentially, I question whether they're even scientists, because you would never, ever think of curtailing debate and communication if you were a scientist. Okay, maybe you need to consult 5 of your colleagues before you're comfortable with putting it out in the world, but then do that. We all do that. I do that. When I write a paper, I consult with a few colleagues here and there, they check, and then if I'm happy that they've done it, at some point, there comes the point where you want to put it out, and you put it out on the archive. And then, of course, everybody understands that there's a published version a year later that comes with revisions, but the important thing is that the core ideas have been communicated immediately at the beginning. So to me, all the arguments that are made against, this research hasn't been peer reviewed and blah, 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 people who make these comments do not even understand peer review and its limitations. It is not because a paper has received the approval of 2 or 3 referees pre-selected by editors that means anything. bullshit. The only thing that means anything is if the paper is out for everybody to see and for everybody to comment on. Yeah, that's what's worth it. And even that is not perfect. So my support for preprints is unquestioned and unlimited. We need people to put their preprints out for the evaluation because we run an open evaluation anyway. And we do have a preprint server ourselves because people don't necessarily want to update the archive or update OSF or the preprint servers. They just say, oh, you know, you have my new version, but then I'll just leave. It doesn't matter. We don't care. Everything's open. Yeah. So,
Ludo, future of preprints.
Yeah, I agree on the importance of preprints. It's an extremely important development, and it's sometimes a bit disappointing to see that there are still people who kind of express all kinds of uneasiness about preprints, while the benefits are really major. But there are two things in relation to the Journal Observatory. On the one hand, of course, the Journal Observatory ideally is going to make visible which journals are supportive of preprinting, which are not. That in itself, I think, will be useful because, for instance, I would probably use that as a criterion for choosing which journals to submit to, which journals not to submit to. So that's helpful. But I also think there's a kind of problem in the way I presented the Journal Observatory, because I presented it around journals, and also in the team, in the team that's now working on this, we are actually now asking ourselves, is that the right way of presenting our ideas? Because we have the preprint servers, and we are going to have, and you already see it happening, all kinds of hybrids between what is kind of the traditional journal and a preprint server. So in some sense, organizing the observatory around journals, at least journals understood in the traditional sense, is, I think, increasingly difficult to justify. So I'm not yet sure how we should deal with that, but I would like ultimately the observatory to be something that offers information around, let's call it, platforms for publishing. Preprint servers, journals, and all kinds of hybrids that are going to emerge in the coming years. So journals should be understood in that broader sense, I would say.
Thanks. A question coming in from Tom Oliehoek to Ludo, saying the observatory should give ideally access to data of quality journals. I think that peer review is essential in the assessment of journals, so it would be good to have metadata that point to published peer reviews for articles in journals. There's no way to check the reality of peer review in the current used shielded system.
Yes, indeed. That's actually quite strange. I always find that quite remarkable. Peer review is clearly one of the key things that journals offer. It has lots of limitations. It's often overrated, but still, it's an important thing journals offer. But actually, we don't have systematic information at the level of individual articles, also not at the journal level, as I mentioned in my presentation. We don't have systematic information on what journals are actually doing. And that's really strange. If we say that this is so important, this quality assurance that peer review provides, then we should at least have information about that. So I can only agree with this.
I think both of you have touched upon in your presentations briefly on the issue of financial sustainability, which is a challenging issue, especially in the open science arena. A lot of open infrastructures that you are both developing are international by nature, used internationally by global communities, but often a lot of the funding streams are organized nationally. And then you come into all kinds of collective action problems. I don't expect us to solve that issue today, but do you want to comment on that? Maybe Jean-Sébastien, you first, because I know you have been struggling with the issues for many years already.
Yeah, so again, we need to book the evening to discuss that because it's such a huge question. But collective action problem, history has so many examples of good ideas that fall because of the collective action problem. And this is a thing which is even exploited by incumbents because they know it's not going to happen. You know, it's almost logically impossible to overcome this collective action problem. So how do you overcome it? Maybe you've got like one super rich benefactor that says, okay, so here's a pot of money, and with that you can just endow your thing and do it for the coming 50 years, and you're done. Yeah. There's the other possibility, the kind of illusory thing that there's this harmonious collection of people coming together and saying, oh, let's just put tiny little crumbs here and make this work. So which would also work. It would cost so much less to these organizations worldwide to form a kind of UNESCO international organization, pooling some money according to resources, even if some pay more than others. Let's agree, yeah, it's completely legitimate for the Netherlands to pay more than, you know, South Africa or other places. Why? Because even if the rich countries pay more proportionally to this, they will pay much less than they would otherwise using the other system. So I think in a sense, you know, I would love Ludo to put a huge financial bit on the Journal Observatory. Let's put the business there, the costs integrated everywhere, included in there. Included, for example, all the free labor that reviewers put in, the free labor that editors put in, the cost of labor of funding agencies having to negotiate with the publishers and things. At my university, for example, or everywhere, you have very often these announcements that finally, you know, we've come to an agreement with that particular publisher. And finally, these scientists, all scientists here can publish for free in those journals. But that's not true because the university is paying those publishers. And also there's a big cost with actually negotiating these things, maintaining these things. SciPost would be able to live, you know, on a much larger scale, just with a fraction of the money that is put to pay people to negotiate the contracts that you haven't even begun paying. It's a level of nonsense, which is staggering. But this is a problem which one cannot solve on one's own. You can only put an opportunity there. And if the opportunity is not taken, then it will pass. That's all I have to say.
Great. I've been informed that I got a bit carried away and that we're really approaching the end of this seminar. But I do want to let Ludo say a few words if you like to.
Yeah, this is clearly a very difficult problem, but we have, of course, some examples of reasonably successful ways of dealing with this challenge. So we have Crossref, which offers valuable metadata on a lot of scholarly outputs, not without limitations, of course, but that's an infrastructure that has been successful in also finding a way of organizing sustainability. You could imagine that a Journal Observatory there might be a similar model possible for that. I also think that we are moving towards a situation where journals that are unwilling or unable, for whatever reason, to actually present themselves to the outside world by making information accessible by making information available about what they are doing. These journals essentially don't exist anymore. Of course, they have a website, etc., but they don't exist in the sense of properly presenting themselves to the outside world. So it will become kind of a mandatory thing for anyone who is running a journal to find a way to participate in these initiatives. And that means that basically all actors in the system need to think about how to contribute to that. So publishers need to take a role in that, but also for journals that follow, for instance, the Diamond open access model, we have other actors in the system that need to think about the responsibility they have in making sure that journals are able to join these developments in terms of being visible in an observatory and things like that.
Thanks, Ludo, and I couldn't agree more. I think we really have now reached the end of our session. Really interesting discussion. I think we could have gone on for much longer, but we don't have the time for that right now. I'd like to thank the speaker, thank the audience also. But before saying goodbye to everyone, I wanted to say that we are already in the process of organizing the next edition of this webinar, which will be held on April the 14th. The topic of the session will then be open tools for data enrichment and visualization. We will have again 2 very inspiring grantees from the Open Science Fund, namely Jill Hilditch and Jitte Wagen from, again, University of Amsterdam, and Roger Kievit from Radboud University. And more information about that can be found on the website of NWO, where you can already register for that session. So please be invited to that session. I hope to see you then. And with that, I want to thank you all. Thanks to the speakers again, and hope to see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.